Good afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us virtually today for this informative webinar, The Flourishing Psychologist, Sleep Care for Self-Care. Today's webinar is being presented by Dr. Lisa Cromer. We welcome her back today. You may remember her from our Compassion and Equanimity as Skills webinar in January. Dr. Cromer is an associate professor in the psychology department at the University of Tulsa. She is the director of SPARTA, the Study of Prevention, Adjustment, and Resilience to Trauma and Adversity Research Lab, and also a co-director of Titan, the Tulsa Institute of Trauma, Adversity, and Injustice. In the interest of time, we've placed her bio on a slide for you. We're very fortunate to have her back with us again today. We're all looking forward to Dr. Cromer's talk today about sleep. We had an overwhelming response to this workshop, and we know that must be because many of you are struggling with sleep, but you also want to take good self-care. So I know you're going to learn a lot in the next hour and a half. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Cromer. Lisa?
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. So you've got the learning objectives on a slide, so I'll skip over those, but I do want to just start with a disclaimer, if I may. This talk does not replace training for cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia, which if you find this talk helpful and educational, that might be a nice next step, particularly if you're interested in using some of this information for your own client work. This talk is really meant to be generally educational for professionals and graduate students. It is not prescriptive. Individual experiences may vary. So please don't be upset or disappointed with the trust or with me if you try something and it doesn't work, but we will be encouraging you to try some different experiments to see if we can improve your sleep. And also, if you have a concern that you might have a sleep disorder, we are going to do an assessment today. It is really meant as a screening tool. It is not a clinical assessment. If you have serious concerns, I really want to encourage you to see a sleep specialist or a sleep doctor, possibly look into having a sleep study done and to seek out treatment from a physician or a behavioral sleep specialist. So just please keep those in mind as we go forward. So Dr. Martin mentioned that we have interactive software. I see some of you found it already, so that is great. This map is an opportunity to first also see where everybody is. The map is provided by the CDC to actually show what parts of the country people experience the most sleep deprivation. And we consider being sleep deprived or sleep insufficient if we're getting fewer than 7 hours of sleep a night. And so we can see very heavy on the East Coast where we have, or on the eastern side of the world, that we have the greatest portion of people who are experiencing, of adults, pardon me, who are experiencing insufficient levels of sleep, but also kind of a fun way to just see where all of our participants are. So we'll be using this PollEv app. If you haven't found it yet, I know it's in the chat, or you can type in pollev.com/Lisa Cromer 275. And I will be getting responses from you as I'm doing talks like this. There's, I think, 500 or 600 of you here now, possibly more. The combined knowledge in our virtual room is far greater than mine. And so I'll be giving you opportunities to weigh in and share some of your experiences and expertise as well. And so I'll look forward to hearing from you. I do want to mention that having a pen and paper might be helpful, especially if you're planning on getting a few tips that you might try something. You're going to hear a lot of information, and sometimes we leave webinars with the best of intentions and then nothing follows through. So I think a good principle is jot down 2 things that you're going to try. So at least you're moving one step forward. I'll also mention math warning ahead because we are going to compute sleep scores. So be prepared for that. Now, just to start us off to kind of learn why are you here? So how satisfied are you with your sleep? Are you super satisfied? You're just here because you love sleep. You want to feel good about yourself and all the great things that you're doing. Are you pretty satisfied? I mean, but everyone can improve a little bit. Or are you more on the not that satisfied and you're hoping to get a little bit more motivation for change? Or maybe you're really in a place where you need a lot of help. So I'm just going to pause here for a sec while people get a chance to find the app and weigh in. I've got a little counter in the bottom and I can see about 100 people have responded. So I'll just let that tick up a little bit more. All right, so now moving on. Okay, so we have a very small portion who are super satisfied, but we've got some people who really need some sleep skills, and it looks like more in the pretty satisfied or not that satisfied and looking to improve. So I hope that you can get something out of today and walk away. What I basically I'm going to do with this talk is we're going to actually do a little sleep screener to get a sense of where you're at beyond your satisfaction. And then I'm going to do my very best to motivate you for change by telling you all the reasons you want to be sleeping better. And then the balance, the third part of the talk is actually talking about different things that you can do, largely drawn from CBTI to improve your sleep and from some of my own research that we've done. All right, so let's see. So in the past month, how often have you, and I've got 8 questions here. So I'm not going to read them all out. I've reworked, this is actually adapted from the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. And so you can print this out and score it on your own, or I tried to reconfigure this to make it easy. So let's say, for example, for question 1, you had trouble sleeping because you couldn't get to sleep within 30 minutes. And you also had trouble sleeping because you get up to use the bathroom for question 3 and you can't get back to sleep. So let's say for questions 1 and 3, that happens all the time. Then you'll be indicating down here that you've got 2 questions, 2 times 0, you'll extend that to 0. And then maybe for all the other 6 questions, they haven't happened to you in the last month. And so you would do 3 times 6 is 18. So you can count up how many questions are 3s, how many are 2s, how many are 1s, and how many are 0s. And so that will get you a score from 0 to 24. So I'm going to just pause here for just a moment to let you do your math. Okay, and then on the next slide, we're going to add to that 0 to 24 score with up to 9 more points during the last month. How often, or how would you rate your sleep overall? How much of a problem has it been for you to keep up your enthusiasm? And how consistently did you go to bed and get up during your sleep wake times? The score those 3 questions, 0 to 9. This is a bit like doing taxes where you've got to carry your scores forward. All right, and now you should have a total somewhere between 0 to 33. And so I'm not going to read all of these out in detail, but on the next slide, I'm going to ask you where you weighed in. But just to give you a little bit of feedback on this screener, and again, this is not meant to be diagnostic at all. We often use this in our research. We use this as a screening tool clinically to see, should we be talking with our clients a little bit more about sleep? Because maybe if there are in the problematic end that we should be pursuing this and maybe talking about some things. But if you're in the 25 to 33 range, congratulations, you're winning gold. If you're in the 19 to 24 range, you're pretty good, and you're probably like the bees on that previous question that I had asked you, that you could probably maybe learn a couple tips. 12 to 18, you're probably struggling with your sleep quality or quantity, and hopefully you'll have a few tools that you'll learn today. And if you're in the 0 to 11 range, you might actually want to look beyond this talk, and talk to somebody about addressing, whether or not your sleep is worth looking at a little bit more. So how did you do? Were you in that low range? Are you a child of hypnosis, the Greek goddess sleep? Curious how all of you are. Or are you in that 19 to 24 range? You're a good sleeper, but you're ready to kick it up a notch. Were you in that 12 to 18 range? Not doing quite as well as you thought, need to learn to master the Z's? Or were you in that 0 to 11 range? All right, as answers are coming in. Great, thank you. Okay, so this is looking pretty similar. Well, actually, some of you were sleeping better than you were giving yourselves credit for in terms of the super satisfied. So that's interesting. Maybe we're a little critical of ourselves sometimes. So it looks like we've got a lot of variability in terms of people's sleep mastery. And in our research that we do in my lab, I do research with children and adolescents on sleep and nightmares. And then I've worked a lot with athletes for the last 10 years on improving their sleep. And this talk is really very, very similar to what we do with athletes in terms of trying to improve daytime functioning, reduce sleepiness, and improve sleep efficacy. My hope is that we can improve your sleep efficacy today, because you can actually we can improve people's locus of control about sleep. So as we get started, I am talking about insufficient sleep today, or kind of sleepiness. I'm not talking about insomnia. And, if you really scored low on that measure, maybe you have insomnia, know that you have insomnia, and there are a variety of other sleep disorders as well. I just want to draw a distinction between insufficient sleep, which was what was indicated on that CDC map that I showed you at the beginning, where we saw, some states, people were up to 40% of people have insufficient sleep, compared to insomnia, which has lower rates, although still problematic. So when we're talking about insufficient sleep, we're talking about a curtailed sleep problem. When we're considering insufficient sleep as a clinical problem, it occurs for at least 3 months for most days of the week, and it results in daytime sleepiness. A distinction between insufficient sleep and insomnia is that sleepiness is remitting when sufficient sleep is obtained. So insufficient sleep is about not creating the opportunity for having enough sleep for whatever reason, and we'll talk about those reasons in a bit. In comparison, when we're talking about insomnia, this is typically difficulty either initiating or maintaining sleep, or early morning awakening, and earlier than when you want to wake up. Also with insomnia, this is not about opportunity to sleep. So people experience insomnia even when they do have sufficient opportunity. So I want to make sure that we've got that distinction here. And so again, the techniques we're talking about are borrowed from cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia, but these generalize to help us for just overall good sleep health. So let's talk about this issue of insufficient sleep. So what causes us to intentionally sacrifice sleep? And I think this could be an individual issue. This could be a cultural issue. To point out here, I've got word cloud written here, and I've written my question with dots. That's to show you, if you have multiple words, please link them with dots or underscores, because the word cloud, if you put multiple words in, will separate all of those words. So you can certainly put in phrases, just connect them. So in terms of what is causing us to to intentionally sacrifice sleep, we've got work is just such a cultural priority for us, isn't it? And so I'm seeing, and on the word cloud, the more of you who use a particular word, the larger, so the modal words will be larger. And so as more of you weigh in, we might see modal words change. So wanting to spend, they're moving around, worried, stressed, productivity, entertainment, grad school, not enough time, too much to do, too little time. So we're intentionally sacrificing sleep, and work as a major factor here. I see also different kinds of work, like housework, um, and kids and teenagers being on here. And so maybe we're intentionally sacrificing sleep because of our kids. My daughter just took an AP exam today, and I'll admit there was some late night studying that I also fell into. Video games, so entertainment, family responsibilities. Great. This is a wonderful, maybe this is a bit of catharsis for some of us as well. Work hustle screens. This is great. Thank you so much. So there's all kinds of reasons. Oh, exercises on there. That's another one. So all kinds of reasons where we actually choose to be sleep deprived. And and their work is in the middle. And so I'm going to be giving us I hope planting some seeds to raise the question of, is it worth it when we're sacrificing our sleep in order to work or do other things on this word cloud? So that's intentionally sacrificing sleep. But sometimes we unintentionally sacrifice sleep. And this might be things that contribute to behavioral insomnia, even. So, what might cause unintentional sleep loss? And there we have it. Anxiety, worry, nightmares can help you with those nightmares. By the way, there's behavioral treatment for that, which is not included in the talk, but Joanne Davis does treatment with ERT. I treat kids with nightmares, so there are treatments available. But yeah, absolutely. So worry, stress, anxiety, hormones, caffeine, I might absolutely drinking, overactive bladder as we get older, allergies. I see vertigo, bathroom, hot flashes. Oh my goodness, hot flashes. I'm with you. Pain, anxiety. This is wonderful. A really, really good list. The dog barking. I've worked with clients where we've had to have that talk about getting the dog door. Absolutely. So thank you for these responses. And so we can really see that in terms of intentional work, school, time, feeling like there's not enough, and then too much to do, too little time, kind of relates to these unintentional things as well, right? So they're not orthogonal concepts, this idea of worry, anxiety, and I'm seeing the pain is growing in terms of a modal response here as well. So, what does the literature tell us in terms of factors that contribute to insufficient sleep, as distinct from other sleep, like from sleep disorders like insomnia? Believe it or not, you guys were dead on with the kids and teenagers. So, having teenagers and children, young children in particular, can contribute to insufficient sleep. Drinking soda, that could be caffeine, as well as other ways that it impacts our body. Work demands, including moonlighting and shift work. And then all the host of things related to stress that you had on the previous slide. And so circadian rhythm disruption, changing our 24-hour sleep clock when we go to bed and when we wake up, is a factor. And that actually, we'll talk about that in terms of COVID. I know some of you mentioned COVID on the previous slides as well. And absolutely, those have been contributors. In the literature, we also see that things like housing and food insecurity, smoke, contribute to insufficient sleep, and then of course behavioral and emotional problems, which I think you had a really, really great list of, and that's showing a lot of experience there. There's a concept in the sleep literature called social jet lag that some of you may be familiar with. And I think we're all familiar with the term jet lag. What happens when you get on a plane and cross time zones, and it just throws our body out of whack for a few days at a time sometimes. So if you hate Mondays, if you binge slept on the weekend and you got that really great sleep on Sunday, and yet when it's Monday morning, it is so hard to get out of bed. Or maybe this isn't you, maybe this is your kids or your partner. That when you're hating Monday mornings and you've got bags under your eyes and yet you got 10 hours of sleep on Sunday, that's social jet lag. The concept of social jet lag is meant to capture how changing our sleep patterns from weekday to weekend, or maybe I could say work days to non-work days, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a weekend. There's a wide variety of different life schedules here. When we are intentionally disrupting our circadian clocks, we're giving ourselves jet lag. And so we can have that chronic feeling of just like jet lag, called social jet lag. And some research has shown that not only is it an awful feeling and it can make Mondays or whatever the equivalent of your Monday is just awful, but it also can contribute to obesity risk and academic risk. And academic risk meaning poor grades, just struggling more at school for high school students and college students. So the message there is that one of the things we want to be aware of is it's not just amount of sleep or quality of sleep, but looking at our circadian clocks. So some of you mentioned COVID, and in preparing for this talk, I wanted to dig into the literature about COVID and sleep. And so just a little bit, there's actually quite a bit that's been published in the last 18 months on this. But particular to our audience that is here, a survey of healthcare workers, 21% were psychologists who completed the survey. They found that 71% reported changes to their sleep schedules due to COVID. And so that meant going to bed later and getting up at a later time than what people had done previously. What the researchers found in this study is that the total sleep time did decrease in COVID. So even though we're working at home and we don't have that commute, and maybe many of you noticed it, I certainly noticed it in my life, due to probably everyone had different kinds of demands. For me, it meant learning 10 different platforms in order to do all the different parts of my job as a professor, that even though I wasn't commuting, I actually was working far more hours when COVID hit. And so for a variety of different reasons, healthcare workers in a variety of different disciplines have actually been getting less sleep once COVID started. And the mean number of hours of sleep in this particular survey was 7 hours, which is on the brink of that insufficient sleep that the CDC and sleep societies have talked about. Researchers also were asking about self-reported mood, and they found that people who were sleeping more hours, so getting 7.5 hours, were reporting having a better mood. Those who were sleeping less, a mean number of hours of 6.83, had a worse mood. And the worse mood was associated also with more screen time, and they liken this to bedtime procrastination, or referring to it as shut-eye latency. Recommendations from this article were to be looking at ways of getting social support. From a work perspective, trying to have more flex time in order to manage sleep. This is definitely a direction that the sleep societies and sleep literature have been going in terms of talking about meeting individual needs by allowing us to have more flexibility in when we're working, in order to also not just manage our sleep, but also stress and mood. So what's your experience? What does sleep deprivation look like at work, or for the students here at school? And again, this is a word cloud, so if you've got more than one word in a phrase, please link them somehow. So your experience is irritability, lethargy, grumpiness, focus is an issue, dragging along. Drowsiness, absolutely. Yawning, having headaches. Migraines were mentioned earlier as a reason for losing sleep. And we can kind of see this feedback loop, right? That if I'm sleep deprived, I might be having migraines. If I have migraines, I might be more having more difficulty sleeping. So, wow, I'm not going to read all of this in the interest of time, but what a wealth of feedback, right? And so much of this is clustering around negative affect and negative mood. I'm also seeing things like eating and more, and it's true that our hormone imbalance that happens as we are getting insufficient sleep can actually make us crave more food and then also stop our brain from being able to detect when we're full. And so we can tend to overeat. And I don't know why this just got so tiny. I think it must be overwhelmed itself. So we've got cognitive issues, behavioral issues, and then mood emotional issues. A consensus statement on getting sufficient sleep that was released by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society um, in 2015 talked about when we get fewer than 7 hours of sleep, all of the things that you all just listed are going to be a factor. The societies reviewed the literature, which included 5,314 scientific articles. And the consensus was that we need more than 7 hours of sleep, that if we're getting fewer than seven, I'm not sure there's anything on here that you didn't catch except maybe increased risk for suicide. I'm not sure that I saw that. And there's definitely a relationship between sleep problems and suicide, not just suicide ideation, like death by suicide, immune system functioning. There's a greater intensity in the experience of pain for people who are getting fewer than 7 hours of sleep. And you've got all of the, I think everything else was mentioned. The consensus statement also talked about what about getting more than 9 hours? And certainly young adults, teenagers often, and yes, kids need more than 9 hours of sleep. So we're not going to call that problematic. If people are sick, if they're recovering from an injury or a surgery, our bodies crave lots of extra sleep. I'm sure many of you have seen that in your lives. Or when we're recovering from a sleep debt. So we might be wanting that 9 hours of sleep on the weekends if we were only getting 6 or 7 hours of sleep during the weekday or our work days. So the consensus statement was really adults, if we want to be functioning well, we really need 7 to 9 hours of sleep for optimal health. I will add in terms of the more than 9 hours, in the sports psychology literature, there was some great work done by Ma and colleagues, I think it was in 2010, doing experiments with sleep extension, and that was getting sleep up to 10 hours for competitive athletes. And they actually saw substantial increases in performance during sleep extensions. And people like LeBron James are very open about talking about how important their naps are. And so we know that just like when you're recovering from an injury or surgery or going through growth spurts where we want more sleep, competitive athletes who are physically using their bodies in intense ways 20 hours a week may also need more sleep. And so for those of you out there who maybe compete in a sport, even if it's recreationally, or you're starting to increase the intensity of your workouts, you may find that you need more sleep. And I wouldn't be alarmed by that at all. So, what are some healthcare provider impairments that you think come with sleep deprivation? And this is a different interface now. I thought you might have more things to say. So, you have the opportunity to write entire sentences without linking words, and everyone else's answers is showing up on your screen. So now you can like other people's answers instead of repeating them, and we'll be able to see what some of the modal things are that you're seeing in your workplace. So I'll give a sec for you to scroll through all of those as we'll see what types of things are coming up when healthcare providers have insufficient sleep or sleep deprivation. So headaches are a big one. Seems like that's a theme here. Lack of focus, less productivity. The irony of the less productivity, right? Because we said that work keeps us from getting enough sleep. That was the modal response. And yet then we end up being less productive at work. And it is, from a logic perspective, it's really kind of interesting that we do that. Concentration difficulty, absolutely. So lack of focus and concentration are pretty similar. Distractibility, inattention. All right. So what I'm going to do here, so because so much of these, impatient, I'm going to hide the lack of focus and I'm going to hide the inattention. Now I'm getting memory, so forgetfulness, absolutely. I'm going to hide the distractibility, lack of empathy. So thinking specifically of healthcare workers, what are things where we might become vulnerable? And forgetfulness can certainly be a problem, irritability or impatient, not being able to be fully present. Okay, I'm going to hide that concentration and see what else and get the lack of empathy. Okay, this is great. And it's a little finicky. I'm just see if I can scroll down to get just a few more of these responses. Burnout is coming. Burnout, making mistakes, fuzzy thinking, more errors. Okay, this is a terrific list. Thank you. Okay. So you guys have done a great job, and this is very consistent with what the literature tells us as well, that when we are getting insufficient sleep, that I think you all got everything on here. That anxiety, depression, I don't think we specifically listed, but you got all the other things that are very typical to see, especially in people in our line of work. Specifically looking at healthcare providers, what researchers more recently looking at this have found is that in addition to the things that you all listed, we're more likely to regret our job choices when we have insufficient sleep. We are more likely to have a reduced sense of personal accomplishment and a diminished resilience. You got the emotional strain and moodiness. Avoidant coping strategies can come into play. And then you certainly were capturing with the empathy and decision making, that fuzzy thinking, the decreased therapeutic effectiveness. And we're actually at greater risk for ethical problems with our clients, having difficulty with boundaries, that type of thing when we're getting insufficient sleep. And so these are, I'm hoping from a motivational interviewing perspective, if you're in that, I haven't been prioritizing my sleep over work, now we're really kind of saying, all right, if you're working and work seems more important than sleep, maybe I need a little bit more balance, and I need to making sure I'm getting in that 7 to 9 range. And if I'm getting 6.5 hours of sleep, maybe my body is going to be fine with 7.5 hours, but that might be worth exploring in order to help reduce my risk for difficulties down the road, or to bring things in line if I'm having some of those difficulties now. Now, some of you talked about burnout. This is a word cloud. What do you think of for burnout? What is burnout? Exhaustion. If you've experienced it, disliking your job, tired of working. Yeah, some of those things that we talked about. Some people know burnout. The burnout literature is when we grab that cynicism as a dimension of burnout. Frustration, depletion. Yeah, so there's a lot of these characteristics that we're talking about that go with insufficient sleep in our profession. And again, this is just filling out so rapidly, showing some of the difficulties that we're all familiar with, whether we've experienced them, seen these in coworkers, or maybe with our clients. So motivation, apathy, a feeling of just exhaustion. And it's really interesting, right? Because you could grab a lot of these and say, wow, some of these things look like depression. And yeah, it may not be depression. It could be this qualitative difference of burnout. So in the burnout literature, which is believed to be caused by high job strain, high work demands, low feeling of control. We have these emotional depletion, loss of motivation, and this exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy rather, that are actually on burnout inventories. So clearly you're aware of all of this. So when we look at research with psychologists and psychology trainees, burnout can lead to personalization of difficult experiences. So that can make it difficult to take feedback in supervision, for example, or from a job evaluation. We're more prone to make those cognitive errors. And again, we can have a competency or ethical issue. What was interesting in this research that Warlick and colleagues did in 2020 was they found that both trainees and professional psychologists who'd been in the profession for a while had similar rates of burnout. And they looked at this across a few different domains, and they found that rates of burnout were higher in personal lives. And this is pre-COVID research, by the way, was higher in personal life than in our professional domains. So when we have a lower risk for burnout, we are going to have an increased locus of control, a reduced sense of randomness of hardship. These are very, very interrelated concepts. And we're going to be managing chronic challenges as one would a chronic illness, and chronic non-terminal illness, for example, like diabetes. So I just want to pause on this for a little bit, because in my own research, we're looking at the relationship between sleep and nightmares and suicidality, and we're actually measuring a sense of locus of control. And we're looking at sleep locus of control and nightmare locus of control, measured at different time points to see if that change in sleep actually relates to a sense of more control in life generally, that might relate to reducing suicidality when we feel less hopeless, helpless, worthless. And so part of when I'm doing these sleep talks, my hope is, even though, maybe I could just give you a few tips and just say, hey, try these, is to really give us some pause to think about that if we're not making choices that are best for our health, where are those choices coming from, right? Because we're in a profession where we're trying to help other people. We want to make good decisions. We're good people trying to help other people. And so sometimes it can be this decreased locus of control. And so when we're talking about sleep health, I'm hoping to raise awareness that there's a lot of choices that you can make that can actually help improve, whether we're talking about sleep onset, your ability to get better quality sleep, that type of thing. And so rather than being a product of a culture that used to brag about sleep deprivation, a culture that sacrificed children's sleep over the cost of money. So for example, one of the reasons why schools started earlier and earlier nationally was because adding school bus rounds and or school bus routes and needing to get kids up earlier, that as we were choosing to have children lose sleep to their harm over money, that we really do have a culture that glorifies work and seems to think that being sleep deprived is a badge of honor. And what the literature is saying is we need to really be thinking about changing that culture. And I think as psychologists, it would be great to see us change that, whether that's in our training programs, in our clinics, in our work environments. From this piece about treating chronic challenges as a non-terminal illness like diabetes, I think this is a wonderful way to think about how some people have done a great job of coping through COVID and have struggled through, is really embracing or accepting that, yeah, this is where it's at. I don't have to like it, but it is the way it is. And so how can we live our fullest life while still embracing these challenges? So I mentioned this idea of efficacy, and what I want to touch on is really thinking about stress and sleep sufficiency and how that relates to burnout. A study was done with stress, looking at stress and burnout in graduate students, and the researchers found that sleep moderated the stress burnout relationship. So when students were getting sufficient sleep, that stress did not relate to burnout. When they were getting sufficient sleep, stress was not leading to burnout. This was a pretty large study with, over 2,600 graduate students across a variety of different disciplines. The mean number of hours of sleep in grad school for these folks was 6.4 hours, but about 62% thought they had good quality sleep. There have been similar studies done in industry as well, and in fact, there's more studies done in industry than done with graduate students or with psychologists, because in industry is where you're really looking at efficiency and getting the most for your dollar out of your employees. And so more work has been done in that area, but I thought this would be more relevant for our current audience. I also just want to mention that a recent study found that sleep disorders were, and this is not just sleep insufficiency, but any kind of sleep disorder, increase the risk for burnout by 4 times. So I think that's an important piece to be aware of. So that is the first part of the talk to, I hope, motivate you and have you on the edge of your seat for thinking, oh, what kinds of choices are we making? And what might be an alternative? And so this talk is called The Flourishing Psychologist. And flourishing, I think you're probably well aware that we can credit Marty Seligman for bringing this to the forefront for psychology, but there's some great folks who've been doing research in how to really help us flourish as individuals. And so why wouldn't we want to flourish, right? Instead of all of those awful things we talked about with sleep deprivation, we're talking about positive emotion and engagement and relationships, things that psychologists love, right? And having meaning and purpose. And so this is quite the opposite of burnout when we're not loving our jobs anymore. So when we look at the literature on how to promote a flourishing, generally speaking, what we're seeing is basic principles of cognitive behavior therapy. And then, of course, acceptance and commitment therapy are kind of neo-CBT, which includes a lot of mindfulness. There's really an emphasis on compassion, as well as an emphasis on competence, self-care, reflection, and relationship. And I know the Trust is doing more and more webinars on things like self-care, as we're recognizing that there's just such a deep need for it, that we are caring for each other or caring for others and then maybe neglecting ourselves and not learning to set those boundaries, including boundaries around when I'm going to check email so I can get a good night's sleep. The emphasis on the flourishing psychologist is really a very prevention emphasis. So rather than focusing on recovery from a problem, that kind of medical model, which many of us were trained in, it's really, I think, much more of a dental model is the way I like to think about it, is how can we have good self-care that, and maybe we should think about good sleep as our fluoride and brushing and flossing, that this is just something for good health that we need to prioritize. I am a trauma researcher, but I really gravitated to the resilience literature pretty early in my career to look at how to help people cope with trauma. There's in Ann Masson's work, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is just wonderful work in terms of really helping us understand the complexity of resilience. And I know I've learned a lot from her. In terms of thinking about models, though, I think that our sort of next generation of thinking, or the next wave of resilience, needs to look beyond just these perturbations where everything is kind of fine and then something happens and then we recover from it. Or in the trauma literature, we talk about post-traumatic growth. Because I think that when we're talking about, again, thinking about like the chronic illness like diabetes, I think that sometimes we've got chronic life stressors that aren't kind of going along, and then there's a perturbation that we need to recover from, but rather a long continuing strain. When we look at the resilience literature, there's a lot of malleable pieces of resilience, and I've highlighted here some of the things that we've been talking about already. Good coping ability, problem solving abilities requires not being fuzzy headed. It requires us to be able to have some good decision making, having a sense of self efficacy, as we were talking about the flourishing psychologist, that positive outlook on life, good self regulation, control of impulses, and arousal. Those are going to be impaired if we are getting insufficient sleep. And so, from a resilience perspective, if I really want to build as much resilience as possible for myself, I really want to be thinking about what are some foundational things that I can do that are going to allow me to have a solid basis for being able to consistently be engaging in these types of practices. So rather than thinking about resilience as how do we recover from a difficult time, I don't think we can call grad school one single difficult time. I think thinking more about a steady uphill climb, like in these pictures, is probably a better way of thinking about a lot of the work stress or school stress or COVID type stress that we have when we've got these accumulating stressors that we need to be able to learn to adapt with. And so this is again where I think it's so important for us to be thinking a little more planfully about sleep, and just saying, you know what, sleep is like water. My body needs this, and it's not an option to sacrifice it for work. When we look at the resilience literature or self-care and self-regulation type training programs, most of these are very mindfully based. And what I've noticed generally is that while we'll talk about compassion, self-soothing, self-regulation, mindfulness, as a clear foundation, that these are skills that are very trainable and very beneficial. What I've noticed is often absent is actually talking about taking care of some basic body needs like sufficient sleep. And mindfulness definitely can be restful, but it's not going to replace needing sufficient sleep. When we think about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, when we think about doing mindfulness-based therapies, often we're starting with values, and we need to look at our values and our behaviors and see, are those aligned? And so if I am dealing with a chronic stressor, maybe that chronic stressor is COVID, maybe that chronic stressor is graduate school, or my pre-tenure job, or starting my new internship, or fill in all of the blanks, dealing with that difficult coworker who won't get enough sleep. What I think is so important for us is to really look at our intention and look at our values, and then try to bring those into alignment. And so self-care needs to be a part of that. And I do think our profession is starting to get there. And I'm thrilled that so many of you are here today to really be having some honest time to really kind of think about these things. So thinking about self-care and sleep care as an ethical obligation, I hope I've made a foundation for that in terms of thinking about our decision-making, the empathy, how we interact with each other. And then what I really want to encourage you, if you're still not quite there because you just don't think that there's enough hours in the day, is to really think about, well, what do you most value? And then how can I start to do some tweaking to bring my choices and my priorities into alignment with those values? What we do know from a research perspective is that self-care efficacy can be measured. We should be measuring it. And so that might be something to really be thinking about as well. High quality self-care does include mindfulness and awareness. There was a recent paper that came out, and I was thrilled to see this, and that they did talk about physical health and they did talk about sleep. And I hope to see more and more of this, that high quality self-care isn't just mindfulness and equanimity and balance and yoga and social support and spirituality. And yes, we need all of those things, but we also need to take time to sleep and just allow ourselves to be unconscious and restful and let our brain do all the things that it needs to do. I mentioned that, so we're now going to be moving into some of the what we can do in just a little bit. I mentioned that I do a lot of work with athletes, and so I just wanted to provide a little bit of a frame, especially for the more research geeks out here, and we're scientist practitioners. That I started doing work with athletes in around 2010 at the University of Tulsa, and I really had a deep appreciation for just how stressful their lives are as athletes, and so started to do programming to really try to promote resilience. And I just said University of Tulsa, and then of course you see Kansas on here, and this is now psychologist Danielle Zanotti. She was a graduate student of mine who had been a Div 1 basketball player and later coach, and so she worked on some of this projects with me. And so looking at all of the stressors that athletes have, it's far more than your typical college student. And some of these athletes have the Greek organizations and have the honor societies and are doing the double majors, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were doing resilience programming to look at how can we help improve mood and performance and all kinds of things. But one of the most effective pieces of programming we did was address the problem of student athlete sleepiness. So we found that about half of our students on campus were really seriously sleep deprived. And as a young professor, or I guess I wasn't that young, as a junior professor at the University of Tulsa, I can't tell you how many students were sleeping in my class. And so I actually had it in my syllabus, no sleeping in class. And I just gently, told them, if I get it, if you're coming in at 4 a.m, if you need sleep, don't come and sleep in my class. Sleep at home, get your sleep, get the notes later. I get that you want to be present, but you're not present if you're sleeping. So what we did was a 1-hour sleep workshop, and it was really geared for the athlete who was skeptical, who knew, didn't want to hear that they needed more sleep because they knew that that was impossible for them to sleep. Are you kidding? With my schedule and travel, sleep goes out the window, and they're getting, 4 to 6 hours of sleep a day, and then maybe getting a nap. And so this workshop was really focused on motivating them to change. And we actually didn't do it as research initially, but we found it was so effective. We thought, we need to collect data and get this published. So what we basically did was a 1-hour sleep workshop. More than half of our athletes made changes in their behaviors just after this workshop. And our daytime sleepiness on campus went down substantially. And in fact, I no longer saw students sleeping in my classes. So we were really, really excited about this. And so I've done a version of this talk for you in terms of talking to you about things that I think matter and are relevant to you and the pressures in your life to hopefully create that motivation for change in order to talk about how to make some of those changes. But what I have coming up first is just I wanted to give you a sense of that research that was so effective. What were some of the things that we presented to athletes? And so if you're working with athletes, if you're doing any kind of behavioral sleep medicine in your practice, or you're trying to get your teenagers to sleep more, I would like to share some of this information with you to maybe help arm you with what the literature says about sleep in athletes. So, and this is not exhaustive, but I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. So reaction time is way better for people who are getting sufficient sleep. And so statistically different in behavioral tasks, where people are way worse on complicated tasks. And so that's important for us to think about as well. Disrupted REM in particular meant slow reaction times. And so one of the things that what I would do in these workshops is show this particular graph or figure of sleep to explain that the longer you're asleep, the more REM, the longer you're continuously asleep. And what a lot of our athletes were doing was they were getting around 6 hours of sleep a night and then taking a nap during the day. And so I was trying to explain to them that look at 6 plus 2 does not equal 8. Look at how much REM you're getting if you are staying asleep and for 8.5 hours. And so by providing this kind of information, we actually were motivating them to consider how can I get that continuous amount of sleep. And so we actually did an adjunctive workshop on time management to help them figure out their schedule. So first we did sleep, and then after we would do, and we still do this, time management to teach them some tricks and tips in order to have a more efficient schedule. And so athletes cared about reaction times. And so that was really, really important. And then we talked about visual motor control, and this is just so critical for any kind of hand-eye coordination. And so we walked through what the research showed in terms of visual motor. We would explain a number of different studies to them to really show them across and talking about specific sports and different kinds of injury, because we see that when individuals are deprived of sleep, they're more likely to need surgeries. They're more likely to have both soft tissue and skeletal injuries. They're slower to come back and from recovery as well. So that can be problematic. And then attention and concentration. You all talked about this earlier on. So we'd explain this to our athletes and how this matters to them with giving specific examples. And so, for example, in like objective testing with 14 days of partial sleep deprivation, there was a 17% attention deficit. And so when we think about from an athletic perspective, how hard people work to just improve, by just a microseconds on the track or slightly improve accuracy, sleep is a way of getting really significant improvements. And then we would explain about sleep and strength and injury, and that this is so important for building a muscle perspective. So we'll talk about how decreased sleep actually is related to decreases in the bench press, leg press, deadlift, that type of thing. We see way more increases in accidents, more not just car accidents, but accidents on the court, in competitions, more likely to have concussions, to have soft tissue damage, get those turn ankles and whatnot when your center of gravity is thrown off because your muscle coordination and concentration aren't so great. You're much more likely to get blindsided. So we give them really some concrete examples of that as well. And I think my favorite part, and we even include this in some version of our nightmare study with kids in terms of trying to motivate them to want to face their nightmares, for an exposure therapy for nightmares, is we explain that when you're sleep deprived, this is similar to being drunk. And researchers have done some pretty cool studies where they've randomly assigned participants to either sleep deprivation condition or to drinking alcohol. And, when we're dealing with college students, what condition they want to be in. But really, really clever research designs where they're keeping people up in the lab, and they're either keeping them up, say, for 24 hours, or sometimes they're only getting 5 hours of sleep for 4 nights. And then they're drinking certain amount of alcohol, and then they're doing reaction time tests and other kinds of tests. And so this particular graph, I just cut and pasted it from this Weinger and Colley Israel article from 2002, that they were looking at relative performance. And then here we're looking at hours of wakefulness compared to blood alcohol concentration. And so what you can see here is that when people have been awake for about 24 hours, across different studies, it can be as much as being an equivalent in performance on objective testing to 0.1. And so depending on where you live, the blood alcohol tolerance for drunk driving might be 0.08, or 0.05. It's 0.05 in Canada and Australia. I'm not sure if that varies state to state here. When we look at lower levels of sleep deprivation, like 5 hours of only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, it's equivalent to about a 0.05. So this really speaks to how dangerous it is to be getting behind a wheel when you're sleep deprived. There's a lot of this research is with medical residents because of the crazy schedules that they all have. But I just really want to encourage, especially anyone who's on this call that maybe pulls all-nighters, that you don't get behind a wheel when you've been up all night trying to get something done. And, I'll admit that I was somebody who often sacrificed sleep until I actually started to get into this literature about 10 years ago. And it was really transformative to me. I really had significant changes in terms of understanding just how bad it was. Other things we share with our athletes, things that they care about, things that you may care about or your clients might care about, is research that has been intentionally exposed people to things like the cold virus. So for example, researchers bringing participants in the lab who've had different amounts of sleep and then giving them a mist of the cold virus and then having them come back to the lab, 4 or 5 days later to see, did they develop the common cold? And when people were averaging fewer than 7 hours of sleep a night, again, what we're calling insufficient sleep, they're 3 times more likely to get the common cold. And if they rated their sleep quality as poor, and so that subjective sleep quality was poor, they were 5.5 times more likely to get the common cold. So pretty compelling from a health perspective. Memory consolidation happens during REM. And so when we're teaching about sleep, and time management, well, explain you should be writing your papers or doing your reports during the day. If you're trying to read and learn for tests or school, or maybe you're learning a new manual, or doing some thinking, or trying to take in new information, really recommend doing that during your later part of the evening, because your memory consolidation happens at night, and so you'll have more efficient learning. We know that memory is impaired. You've all spoke about that when sleep is insufficient. And, just as a reminder, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, and then also things that we learned in, our early psychology classes, the interference that can happen. And so when you're trying to learn information, if you go to sleep after you learn it, you're going to have a higher level of retention rather than going about your day and doing a lot of other things. So we really kind of factor in some of that sleep education. So not only are we trying to motivate people for change, but we're trying to show them that there's different areas where you can make some changes, to maybe even have a multi-pronged approach. And so that's going to lead me to the what can I change? And so we've identified that maybe we need to change our schedules and literally just move pieces around like a Rubik's Cube, that maybe I just need to quit taking that nap during the day and be tacking that on to my total nighttime sleep time. But we also want to talk about quality and how to improve quality as well. So let's talk about how to make some improvements. And so one way that you can fall asleep faster is to avoid cell phones at least an hour before bed. There are electromagnetic waves that are emitted by your cell phone. If you actually go into the warnings in your phone, you'll see that this is a real thing. And these can block the release of melatonin. If we can resist the urge to use any TVs or computers, any kind of screens before an hour or two before bed, that can be super beneficial. So go old school analog and read your journal articles before bed on paper. Use classical conditioning to help yourself get to sleep quicker. So if you toss and turn, there's a number of different things that you can do. This is all from CBTI. So, and I don't talk about classical conditioning when I'm giving talks to athletes or the public. I'm speaking to you as psychologists, that you can understand that underlying mechanism, that what we're going for here is we may have classically conditioned our beds or our bedrooms to be where we should be worrying or where we should be studying. And what we might need to do is recondition that And so there's something called you might see it as a 15-minute rule. Some places you'll see it as a 20-minute rule, that if you go to bed and you are not able to sleep, get out of bed. Do something relaxing, do something calm. I actually think it's great to have a worry jar or a worry journal. Get out of the bed, get into a chair. Do not worry jar or worry journal in your bed, because bed should be saved just for sleep or sexual activity. And so, what we want to do, if we're tossing and turning, get all those ideas out of your bed and into the jar, into your journal, and then schedule time to worry. We know that scheduling time to worry can be really effective. We have a worry jar as a component in my nightmare treatment for kids, and we see a lot of kids already sleeping better as soon as we introduce that worry jar. Evaluate your sleep routine. Some people say they don't have a routine, and I doubt that. I think that we can just have routines that we haven't acknowledged are really unhealthy routines. So, for example, maybe your sleep routine is yelling at your kids 5 times to get to bed and tell them to lay out their clothes and going up and down the stairs. And maybe the routine we've developed is actually very arousal creating. And so, one of the things that I really like to do with my clients, whether they're kids or adults, is have them set an alarm on their phone. I'll introduce them to all the variety of different options that you now have on your phone. So if you go to screen time and do not disturb, if you've got an iPhone, there's equivalents on Androids. You can have things shutting down your phone, but before you have it shut down, set an alarm and then change the name of that alarm to something that's going to resonate for you. So if I said something today that actually is motivating you, something that's important to you, like I know I'll be happier, or this is important, or for my kids, if nothing else, whatever it is, name the alarm that thing that's going to cue for you, and then have a really pleasant sound. So not a blaring alarm, it's time to go to bed, but actually something, maybe it's a reminder that will help evoke some positive emotions for you. And then actually have your bedtime routine. So that might, even though we don't want big meals before bed, we want to avoid alcohol, we want to avoid caffeine. It's actually encouraged that don't go to bed hungry so that your stomach is grumbling. Have a light snack. That's okay. And then maybe you're going to put your PJs on and brush your teeth, take out your contact lenses, read your books, review your notes, whatever it is, lights off, go to bed. If you do that within a week to 10 days, when that alarm goes off, you're already going to be yawning, that you're going to be classically conditioning your brain to be emitting these melatonin. And so maybe part of your routine is dimming the lights. Go splurge on a really nice lamp that you like so that you get overhead lights off, for example. So before I say anything else, what are things that you already know that you should be or could be avoiding at bedtime? So avoiding TV, caffeine, phones, blue lights, decisions. Yes, avoid decisions at bedtime. Unless you're somebody where making a decision lets you feel peaceful. I know that for some families, having the kids lay out what they're going to wear tomorrow ends up being a big fight. And for others, that just, all right, I feel like I don't have to worry about that. So there's a lot of individual differences in terms of figuring out what's going to be the right routine for my family and for me. So avoiding big conversations, that's great. Avoiding water. So anything that's going to be cognitively stimulating, I've learned the lesson of don't check email before bed, because that can just be a giant vortex into answering questions. And now 25 minutes is gone, or now I'm working in problem solving. So really allowing ourselves to turn our attention to things that are positive. So this is wonderful. And I'll just let you read all of the things, but we've got exercise. In terms of exercise, it's okay to do a little bit of relaxation, maybe mindfulness, maybe a body scan, but we want to avoid exercise too close to bedtime because it heats up our bodies. And when our bodies are hot, we can't sleep. So we want to be exercising earlier so that we're not having that high level of arousal. And in fact, one of the reasons why older people go to sleep earlier and wake up earlier is their bodies are changing and we're getting hotter earlier in the morning. So that's a big factor. Okay, this is a great list. Political discussions. And I don't know if you can fully avoid parenting, but I appreciate this sentiment there. So in the literature, I think you hit all of the good things. So, and stimulation is a big thing. So those are things to avoid at bedtime. In the morning, don't hit the snooze button. And I probably should have had a poll to see how many of you snooze, but I was wanting to make sure I end on time. So if you are snoozing, some folks have done these talks and they tell me they snooze 4 or 5 times. I want you to think back to how many hours you're continuously asleep and how much REM you're getting. And if you are hitting the snooze button, you're telling yourself you've bought into this myth that you're getting a little bit more sleep, but you're not. You're getting a little bit more awake. So I really discourage any form of snoozing. If you really have to, snooze once for 3 minutes. But I can't tell you how many people tell me they snooze for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. And I'm like, you are shooting yourself in the foot. And so I'll set these up as an experiment or a challenge of just try it for 2 days, not hitting the snooze button, and just set your alarm, not for the time you wish you would wake up, but for the time you have to. So if you need to be up by 7:45, so you set your alarm for 7 and you snooze till 7:45, set your alarm for 7:45. Instead of getting up at 7 and losing your 45 minutes of snoozing, get 45 minutes of sleeping and get some really good quality sleep. Oh, right. And so what are things to do or add in the evening? We've talked about the bad stuff, what to avoid or not to do. What are some of the things that we could do or add to routines? We've got meditation, we've got reading, lavender. So scents that could be relaxing, yoga, stretching, not hot yoga, but maybe a yin yoga could be good. Maybe a hatha yoga. This is wonderful. And I'm not going to read all of this as well, but just take a look and maybe you'll see something. I see prayer on here. When we talk about cultural adaptations to all of our different treatments, I think it's really important when we're doing CBTI to find out from a spirituality perspective, what are things that could be beneficial. And I tell you, Catholic clients just jump all over rosary to fall asleep to. This is a wonderful thing to have as part of a bedtime. And so I really want to encourage thinking about within somebody's culture, value system, faith system, what are things that could be beneficial. And so I'm seeing some of these things here as well. Stretching, bathing, sex, absolutely. These can be wonderful. Having a shower for some people could be a great thing. Chamomile, self-love, having nice bedding, absolutely. So thank you very much for all of these things. I'm going to just add a few things that you could do to control your sleep environment. Using an app to have some background noise. Some people call it white noise, or having a fan. There's apps, Rain is one that I'm familiar with, can allow you to drown out snoring or noisy neighbors, but it also allows you to have a more consistent environment. So, thinking about kids who sleep half the time at dad's house and half the time at their other dad's house or at mom's house, being able to use an app can help the subconscious know that I'm in a safe place. Using sleep masks or blackout curtains, I cannot encourage enough. Keeping your phone 6 feet away from your head and having it on airplane mode will stop disruption of electromagnetic waves. There's a lot of disagreements within households about optimal temperatures. What the research will say is 67, 68 degrees is an optimal temperature for sleeping, not 62 and not 75. Somebody on the previous slide mentioned comfortable bed, and we actually discourage heavy bedding and having lighter layers. Some people love bamboo sheets, so that as your body temperature is changing during the night, it's easy to fling something off and fling it back on, or let your toes peek out. Removing clocks from the room. No peeking, no looking at clocks. When you are looking at a clock, you are engaging your brain. And so you're inviting the opportunity to think about how much more time do I have to sleep, or what should I be doing? Or you're creating an opportunity to start judging yourself for the quality of your sleep. So you wake up, everybody wakes up. Young adults are waking up 6 or 7 times a night. Older adults might be waking up 20 times a night. That's what happens when we sleep. Our job is just roll over and continue to go back to sleep. Really, one of the first things I do is encourage people to get TVs out of the bedroom, or whatever the equivalent of a TV is as well. Time management, I mentioned, so I wanted to just offer a few suggestions around time management. One is that we should study or do research. If you're going to do things that you want to learn, actually at night can be a great time, so that memory consolidation and low level of interference. Write your papers and your report during the day, not late at night. Try to keep those circadian rhythms constant. We don't want to binge on sleep on the weekend. And one of the recommendations I have for people who love to binge watch Netflix is get out of bed on whatever your sleep-in morning is. Maybe it's Saturday, maybe it's Sunday, maybe it's Wednesday, whatever your schedule is. Binge watch TV in the morning. Just keep your fuzzy slippers and your cozy jammies on. And instead of staying up till 2 a.m., go to bed at your usual bedtime, and then get up to do that binge watching, so that you keep those circadian rhythms constant and avoid your social jet lag. Make a commitment not to check email after a certain time of night. You get to choose what time that is. And people can just get to know that, yep, they didn't get you, and that's an important self-care boundary, I think. And if you do need to cut your sleep short, I really urge people to do it on the morning side rather than on the late side. So for example, if you've got one more hour of work to do before you turn that thing in, like at TU, grades were just due at noon on Tuesday. So, at 11 o'clock, which was already late for me, I was like, okay, I'm done. Students were still handing things in. I'm like, but I'll get up in the morning. And so I still had 2 hours of work to do, but what I'll do is still go to bed at a reasonable time, and then get up at that like 6 or 7, and then I'm fresher, my brain is refreshed, and your productivity is way, way higher if you do that. And rather than pushing, it's amazing what you can do. Napping is not fully discouraged. Oops, I did not mean to do that. The power nap, though, I just want to make sure it's really recommended that napping would be 20 to 30 minutes long. High performers tend to take naps on a regular basis. It can be part of their regular routine. If you typically crash at 3 o'clock and you can have a nap, great, do it regularly at 3 o'clock. I think we all should have that. Never should have stopped in kindergarten. What researchers have found is that if we sleep too long, 45 minutes can increase our likelihood of getting into deep sleep and feeling very sluggish when we wake up. And then the people who do the 1 to 2 hour naps are actually really running the risk of impeding on their ability to go to sleep later at night. So really encourage, if you use the power nap, to keep it short, and to, again, experiment with that, because there's going to be individual differences. If you're tired and driving, pull over, have a power nap. Sometimes that 10-minute nap can be all the difference in the world. So now I'm asking for a commitment. And again, this is one where you can type, and then you can like other responses and say, I'm going to do that. So what are some things that you want to give a try to? Turning over the clock. What are some things that you learned and you're like, you know what, there's the nugget. That is going to be my takeaway. I like that, no alcohol at night, just less alcohol at night. Well, we're moving in the right direction. Alcohol, there's such a myth around alcohol that a glass of wine is going to relax me and help me get a better sleep. A glass of wine might relax you, but in the end, even though it might help you fall asleep faster, you're going to have poor quality sleep. So I really recommend that alcohol not be used as a sleep aid. Regular bedtime, can't recommend it enough. And you might play around with what's an optimal bedtime for you. You know, adolescents are wired to want to go to bed later. So those of you who have teenagers and you're frustrated that they want to work at midnight or 1 a.m., let them. If it is what research has shown is that something happens in adolescence and their optimal time bedtime might be somewhere around 11 p.m. to 1 or 2 a.m. and their optimal wake up time might be more like 9 or 10 in the morning. So regular bedtimes, turning over the clock, stop watching TV before bed, that's great. Turning off electronics sooner. What else do we have here? All right. Awesome. Phone 6 feet away. I will say that I've probably a 50 to 60% hit rate that when people keep their phone 6 feet away, turned on airplane mode, they'll come back to me literally the next day. So this is higher than I would get with a placebo effect, right? Placebo effect would be about 30%. That at least 50% of people we've worked with have said, wow, what a difference. So I really encourage that. So Dr. Martin, I know you might have a question or two, and they can continue to answer these, and we can let this scroll for a bit if you have a question.
Sure, there are lots of questions. First of all, thank you. This has been wonderful. I think a lot of people, based on the responses and questions, have learned a lot. So here's your first question. It's a multiple layer question. How does going to sleep very late, like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., but being able to sleep late affect people? Is sleeping at certain times better for getting higher quality sleep? I understand about consistency, but I mean starting to sleep late at night rather than earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a good question. And I mentioned with teenagers that that will be optimal for them. I think it's an individual differences. And so even when we look at, with almost everything in psychology, we're looking at averages. And so if you're talking about somebody in your household or a client that you're working with, I would honestly experiment with it. And, we've had people in our studies that their bedtime is 2 or 3 a.m. and they're getting up at 10 or 11 a.m. and that works for them. And if they can show us in their data, we don't fight it. But if they're still showing daytime sleepiness, the daytime sleepiness is going to be the big factor. If you're yawning, if you're drowsing, there's a great measure called the Epworth Sleep Scale. You can get online, Google it, put PDF, and it'll pop up. It's free. That's a great little screener to use. And it's like, if you're sleepy and you're getting 8 hours of sleep, you probably need to adjust that time. Yeah, great question.
Okay, good. Many people feel they don't get sleep, but they actually get more than they think. How can we truly track how much sleep we get?
Well, I'm not sure that it's really that important to really track it if you're getting enough sleep. It is absolutely true in sleep studies that people think that they're up all night, or, if your kids or your neighbor or your client is saying, I got no sleep last night, it's not true. They are getting lots and lots of sleep. And, there's so many different apps on the phone and on Fitbits or various other devices, and people are really getting obsessed with, how do we measure it? If you're not doing sleep research, or I don't know why we really need to measure it other than looking at the effects of, are you feeling like you're getting enough sleep? I think that subjective piece is the most important.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Early in your talk, you were talking about 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and a couple of people asked, do you mean totally uninterrupted sleep for 7 to 9 hours?
Yeah, uninterrupted to a point. Like, we are going to wake up throughout each sleep cycle. And so if you're getting up to go to the bathroom, which many of us do, especially as we age, I recommend having like a night light or a soft light so that you can just go do that and then crawl back into bed and and that will count as some of that continuous for sure. Yeah.
Good. And I do think you addressed this, but because it was asked, I'm going to throw it out again. Is it detrimental to your circadian rhythm to sleep more on weekends than you do during the week?
Yep. That's the social jet lag.
Right.
But the reason to do it is if you have a sleep debt. So if you aren't getting enough sleep during the day, during the week, or your working days, don't continue to maintain that sleep debt. You're better off to go with the social jet lag than the chronic sleep debt, which really is going to impact your immune system and just all kinds of things physiologically.
Okay, good. And then switching just a little bit from the questions we've had, you were talking about the worry jar, and some people wonder, what are people putting in the worry jar? What's in there?
Oh, that's a great thing. So do you mean like the type of content of people's worries? So, in terms of physically putting in the worry jar, sometimes it's like little slips of paper and notes, but that could be, I'm not going to do great on my test tomorrow, or my advisor might hate me, or, my boyfriend might break up with me, or, whatever that might be. Just put it all in there and worry about it later.
And symbolically, yes, that's what it means. You're putting it in here. You've stated it, put it in here and move on, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, yes. What about using the yellow colored lens in glasses to mitigate the blue light from the TV or tablet for reading?
It's a really good question. And there has been some good research to show that there are some benefits of using those blue light filters. And the long term, I'm not sure has really been looked at, but I think that there can be some mitigation of the negative effects for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then what about weighted blankets? Are they good or bad?
Good question. I've heard mixed reviews. Like anecdotally, I think people say they love them. And I mean, if something's going to help you sleep better, go for it. Generally the recommendation is not, but I think again, individual differences. And I think for kids and adults with autism, apparently weighted blankets can be really beneficial. I looked at the literature probably a year and a half ago, and I haven't looked at it more recently, that there wasn't a ton on it beyond case studies and qualitative reviews. I'm not sure if anyone's actually done anything quantitative and randomly assigned. So I think that's a limitation in terms of our knowledge right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, great. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And I have to find it. Sorry.
Okay.
My sleep pattern has changed since I had COVID. I still fall asleep fine, but haven't gotten more than 7 hours since. Any research on neurophysiological changes with COVID and sleep?
I don't know about the neurophysiological to tell you exactly what it is, but what we think is probably related to it is stress, all like the anxiety, that type of thing, but also our ability to be at home and have more control has also been balanced by having kids and other types of things that have disrupted it. So, in terms of thinking about if the was a question about the effects, yeah, I think I actually lost that. I got thinking about all the things I read about COVID, and I think I lost
That's all right. No, it was, is there any research on the changes with COVID that could impact? COVID causes neurophysiological changes that then impact sleep.
Got it. So, yeah, so I think the way I would take that is COVID has just created disruption that has resulted in the loss of sleep. And then from a neurophys perspective, the loss of sleep, we already know about that in the literature in terms of the immune system and endocrine system and various other things.